Hi there, and welcome to People Soup. Real conversations about work, leadership, and being human, grounded in behavioural science, with practical ideas you can actually use. I'm Ross McIntosh, and today's episode is a little different. For years on People Soup, I've had the privilege of speaking with brilliant guests from around the world. But in this episode, I want to share some of my own reflections. Reflections from leadership, coaching, organisational psychology, and from years of trying to understand a question that has fascinated me for a very long time. Why do good people do things they later regret? And what does that mean for leadership? So get a brew on and let's explore. I want to start with that question. Why do good people do things they later regret? Way back when, in one of my civil service jobs, I was head of conduct and discipline for a large government department. It was a fabulous job. I led a team who were exploring real cases of human behaviour at work. And things we explored were accessing inappropriate websites from work, sharing intimate photos on work systems, conflicts, selling the story of a high-profile affair, disciplinary hearings and suspensions, and much more. And at first I thought these were conduct issues. Over time, I realised they were behaviour stories. And the more of these cases I sat with, the more fascinated I became by a very simple question. What actually drives behaviour at work? Because underneath those policies, underneath the procedures, underneath the conduct issue, there was usually something deeply human going on. Avoidance, fear, status, shame, loneliness, and sometimes the need to belong. And over time, I realized that leaders weren't exempt from any of this. I just didn't have the language for it yet. And then I discovered ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. And suddenly, years of observing human behavior and considering my own actions started to make sense. So here's my working hypothesis. Under pressure, leaders often default to behaviors designed to reduce discomfort rather than create impact. And I've collected many examples over the years, and I started to notice 6 recurring patterns of behavior. And I've absolutely been guilty of some, if not all, of these myself. So I'll run you through those 6 patterns. The first is control and rigidity. A leader who can't stop stepping in, who says they're empowering people while rewriting the presentation at midnight. Sounds relatable, eh? Number 2, defensiveness and ego. The leader who experiences challenge as a threat, who explains instead of listens, or who says they want honest feedback and then subtly punishes the person brave enough to give it. Number 3, avoidance. That difficult conversation gets pushed back for another week, and then another week. And the rub is that avoidance rarely feels like avoidance when we're doing it. Number 4, reactivity. The old classic, the email sent too quickly by a keyboard warrior on autopilot. The sigh in the meeting. The sarcastic comment that lands badly. They all feel very human. Number 5, values drift. A leader who slowly becomes someone they never intended to be. Not dramatically, but incrementally. And number 6, the narrow thinker. The moment pressure makes curiosity disappear, when there's only one right answer, and it happens to be yours. Now, what's important here is that none of these behaviours automatically make someone a bad leader. They make them human. And under pressure, human beings often narrow their attention and their behavioural repertoire. And eventually, I started noticing something else. Most of these behaviours happened incredibly quickly. Before reflection, before curiosity, before intention. And that's what eventually led me to what I now think of as the gateway skill, the pause. And I want to tell you a story about the pause. A few years ago, I was invited to give an introductory talk about ACT in the workplace to a tech startup. It was for about 60 people. The chief people officer was really keen on ACT, and I had multiple meetings with them to prepare and design a 45-minute presentation that had the best chance of landing well. So the day arrived. I'd prepared my background and my slides, and I was ready. After a beautiful introduction, I launched into my presentation. I thought it was going pretty well, and I'd been talking about the pause and how useful it was. I positioned it as a superpower. And at that point, the CEO raised their hand and said, "Thank you, Ross. This is so interesting. But we don't pause here. We're agile, we're sharp, we're responsive. It's part of the USP of this organization. We crack on and we get shit done." And I responded. I tried again to illustrate the behavioral benefits of the pause. But I could see I was losing the room. I could see in the chat that naturally, social conformity and agreeing with the boss, lots of people were agreeing with him. And maybe you can imagine what was going on inside of my head. That sort of internal panic and that, oh my God, the rest of my presentation isn't going to land well because it's all built around the pause. And after the presentation, on reflection, I also realized something. The pause can be deeply countercultural. But without pause, urgency becomes identity, reaction becomes leadership, and speed becomes virtue. And for me, the pause isn't passivity. The pause creates choice. And I distinguish between a macro pause, a time for reflection, and a micro pause, which is when we catch ourselves in flight and adjust our trajectory. Needless to say, I didn't get the follow-on work with that company, which is probably a blessing, given the cultural attitude to the pause. Now, what's interesting is the pause on its own isn't enough, because you can pause and still have absolutely no idea what's going on in yourself, in the room, in your life. And if the pause creates space, awareness helps us understand what's actually occupying it. And for me, awareness arrived through what I can only describe as a metaphorical itch. So I'm going to look back again at my civil service career, which was going pretty well. I've been promoted several times. There was outward success. But I had this metaphorical itch, that sense that something doesn't quite fit anymore. And I can't remember how it came about, but I was having a conversation with my husband where I said, "What will I be remembered for?" And his response was, "That's easy. You won't be remembered." And folks, this was said with love, but perhaps a little more directly than a Brit might expect. And this is where awareness became internal, contextual, and existential. I began noticing buried doubt, restricted creativity, a narrowing future, and perhaps a values mismatch too. But what awareness did, it gave me choice. And it took a while, maybe 18 months, but then an opportunity presented itself. And I made the decision to leave the civil service and pursue a master's in organisational psychology, where I discovered ACT. Because I believe you can't lead beyond what you notice. And that conversation with my husband didn't immediately change my life, but it changed what I started paying attention to. And awareness can become uncomfortable like that, because once you notice misalignment, it becomes much harder to pretend you haven't. And eventually, awareness asks something of us. Action, not performative action, not dramatic action, but authentic action. And I'm going to tell you about a coaching client of mine who was doing tremendously well in their career. They were on track to become the youngest partner ever in the law firm where they worked. Externally successful, internally miserable. Their life seemed to be organized around achievement, expectation, and not disappointing people. But their values were of service, connection, helping, and contribution. It was like she wasn't choosing her life. she was managing other people's disappointment. Authentic action isn't about rebellion, it's about alignment. And here's where leadership gets complicated, because acting authentically doesn't always mean making radical changes. Sometimes it means learning how to express yourself differently in a changing environment without abandoning what matters. Which brings me to adaptability, and I'll share a little story from another coaching client, a chief people officer who'd moved from the private to the public sector. They were high energy, very capable, and very clear on what value HR could add to a system. And in the new public sector context, they noticed resistance, bureaucracy, muted responses, and a cultural mismatch. And when we started working together, she described that she was dimming herself, noticing behaviours like withdrawal, self-doubt, hesitation, overthinking. Why can't I create the impact I used to create in this organisation? And her behaviour made sense in context. Adaptability didn't mean becoming less herself. It meant learning how to express herself differently in a new environment. And this is important because flexible leaders adapt their approach without abandoning themselves. And what struck me about that work was how much insight came afterwards, not in the middle of the struggle, but in the reflection on it, which is why I think there's one final leadership loop that often gets neglected, and that's the review. Because experience alone doesn't create wisdom. Reflection does. And when I reflect on my own leadership journey, I think part of what shaped me most was spending years hiding parts of myself, managing perception, scanning environments, using humour, trying to fit in, and self-protection. And there's something about hiding yourself for long enough that teaches you a great deal about authenticity. Because there's something about growing up gay and eventually coming out that teaches you a great deal about self-protection and also, eventually, about authenticity. And maybe that's why ACT resonated so deeply with me, because underneath all the models, frameworks, techniques, and leadership theory was something much simpler. Human beings trying to protect themselves from discomfort, whilst also trying to live meaningful lives, including leaders, including me. So maybe leadership isn't about becoming fearless or endlessly confident. Maybe it's learning to notice what's pulling you away and choosing what matters anyway. Because pressure doesn't reveal who we are. Pressure reveals what's running us. And that, Pea Supers, can be changed. Pea Supers, that's it. My reflections on why good leaders go off track in the bag. You can find a link to the description and illustration of my leadership framework in the show notes. As ever, thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing People Soup with others. You're helping us bring evidence-based ideas to more people. Until next time, look after yourselves, Pea Supers, and bye for now.